Breaking. A last-minute update has just dropped. An injured Cubs pitcher could be the Cubs' elite reinforcement for the playoffs. But before I tell you this bombshell news, my fellow Cubby, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can always stay up to date with the latest Cubs news. Cubs fans, hold on to this one. What seemed impossible just a few months ago is now starting to take shape, and it could completely change Chicago's plans. When Shelby Miller signed a 2-year, $2.5 million contract with the Chicago Cubs, practically nobody expected his name to become such a major storyline again in 2026. After undergoing Tommy John surgery last October to reconstruct the ulnar collateral ligament in his elbow, the most cautious outlook pointed toward a lengthy recovery, with no rush and the primary focus being on the 2027 season. The idea was simple: protect the player, respect every stage of the recovery process, and avoid taking any unnecessary risks. But Shelby Miller seems to have decided to completely ignore that script. In a move that caught attention during the Cubs' current series against the Washington Nationals, the organization confirmed that the veteran right-hander was sent to the Knoxville Smokies at Double-A, taking another major step in his rehabilitation process. And here's the detail that makes this story even more interesting. Miller had already appeared for the Iowa Cubs at Triple-A last Sunday. In his first outing, he worked 1 inning, allowed 1 run and 2 hits, but also showed that there is still something extremely valuable in that arm. 2 strikeouts and signs that his arsenal remains dangerous. More important than the numbers, however, was the physical response. His elbow responded well, without the kind of issue that could interrupt or delay the process again. And now he is moving on to another stage. For a player many people assumed wouldn't even be available in 2026, that is huge. And perhaps this is exactly where Chicago Cubs fans need to start paying attention. Because the season is entering the stage where every little detail can make a difference. Chicago has been putting together a strong campaign, competing near the top of the National League and trying to stay in the race for the top of the Central. But everyone knows the regular season is one thing. October is completely different. In the playoffs, a 2 or 3 run lead can disappear in just a few minutes. A tired bullpen can turn an almost guaranteed victory into an elimination. And a reliable pitcher who can enter a high-pressure situation can be worth far more than it may seem. That is exactly why Miller's return is generating so much excitement. Imagine the scenario: the Cubs reach September needing to protect a narrow lead. The pressure rises. Opposing hitters start closing the gap. And suddenly, an arm that practically nobody expected to have available this season appears. Shelby Miller. Not as a distant promise for 2027. Not simply as a player for the future. But as a potential piece for the final stretch of 2026. And it is precisely that possibility that turns a simple rehabilitation assignment into potentially huge news for Chicago. Of course, there is still a long road ahead. The fact that Miller is advancing to Double-A does not automatically mean he will be on the Major League roster in September. He still needs to demonstrate consistency, durability, and, most importantly, prove that his arm can handle an increasing workload. But the simple fact that the Cubs are allowing him to advance at this pace already changes the outlook. And what if he keeps responding like this? That is where things get really explosive. If Miller can complete the next stages without any setbacks, Chicago could potentially evaluate activating him during the final stretch of the season. That would put a player on the roster who, at the beginning of the year, appeared almost certain to make little or no significant contribution in 2026. And think about the impact. The Cubs wouldn't necessarily have to give up valuable prospects to acquire another weapon on the market. They wouldn't have to rely exclusively on an outside signing. They could simply find a piece within their own organization, a player who had been quietly working his way back while the rest of the roster battled through the season. It would be a reinforcement from within. And perhaps the most frightening part for opposing teams is the possibility of Miller arriving without the same accumulated workload as a pitcher who has gone through an entire season. After months of working through his recovery, every appearance is another test. Every inning builds confidence. Every strikeout fuels the hope that this arm could still make a difference when the games truly matter. But there is one question now beginning to circulate among Cubs fans. What if Shelby Miller is actually ready for October? Because if that happens, the Cubs bullpen could look completely different. A player who was supposed to be thinking only about 2027 could suddenly enter the picture at exactly the moment Chicago needs depth the most. And in such a tight race, an unexpected piece could be the difference between a promising season and a genuine championship run. Northside fans already know this feeling. September brings pressure. October brings even more. And when every game starts carrying the weight of an entire season, nobody wants to discover too late that the team was missing one more weapon to close out games. Maybe that weapon is already in Chicago. Maybe it is in Knoxville right now. And maybe Shelby Miller is much closer to Wrigley Field than anyone imagined when he began his recovery. For now, the next step is to carefully monitor his performance at Double-A and how his arm responds to the increased demands. Nothing is guaranteed. But one thing has already changed. The return that once seemed to belong only to 2027 is now beginning to enter the horizon of 2026. And if Miller keeps progressing without setbacks, Cubs fans, get ready. Because we could be looking at one of the biggest surprises of the final stretch of the season. A reinforcement nobody expected. An arm that could return at the most important moment. And a new weapon that could be heading to Wrigley Field right when Chicago needs it the most. Now I want to hear from you, Cubs fans. Do you believe Shelby Miller can be a real weapon for the Cubs in the playoffs? Yes or no? Don't leave without sharing your opinion. Your participation helps make every discussion even more interesting. And make sure to subscribe so you can follow all the latest Chicago Cubs news. And if the news about Shelby Miller was already enough to put Chicago Cubs fans on high alert, what happened behind the scenes at the trade deadline reveals that the front office is thinking about much more than just the final stretch of this season. Because while Chicago may be on the verge of getting an unexpected reinforcement for the playoffs, the front office also made a decision that could shape the future of the franchise. A name that other teams desperately wanted to include in trade talks was simply taken off the table by the Cubs. And the reason behind that decision could be even more important than it appears. We're talking about Pedro Ramirez. The 24-year-old reportedly became one of the most coveted names among the teams that spoke with the Cubs during the busy trade window. Rival teams were willing to ask, push, and try to figure out the price it would take to pry the player away from Chicago. The front office's answer? No. And it wasn't a no followed by lengthy negotiations or an attempt to drive up his value. The understanding within the organization is that Ramirez simply isn't available. That reveals something much bigger than a decision made during the trade deadline. The Cubs are already thinking about the next generation. And Pedro Ramirez is increasingly at the center of that plan. The organization knows that major changes could happen to the roster soon. With important names like Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki entering a decisive period in their contracts, Chicago needs to think not only about how to win right now, but also about who will be carrying this team in the years ahead. That's exactly where Ramirez becomes so important. The idea behind the scenes would be to prepare the young player for an increasingly significant role in the outfield, especially heading into next season. And there's one detail that makes this story even more interesting. Ramirez was not originally an exclusively outfield player. His ability to play multiple positions is precisely one of the qualities that has caught the coaching staff's attention. In an MLB that is becoming increasingly demanding and strategic, having a player who can quickly adapt can be an enormous advantage. And his offensive talent is also starting to show. With a .295 batting average, Ramirez has shown that he doesn't need to rely solely on defense and versatility to justify the organization's confidence. He can also produce at the plate. Even more impressive is the way he has handled some of the best pitchers in baseball. Ramirez wasn't intimidated by names like Tarik Skubal and Paul Skeens, two arms capable of turning any at-bat into a true survival test for a young hitter. And that says a lot. Because talent is one thing, personality is another. A player can put up excellent numbers in the minor leagues, but when he faces a dominant major league pitcher, the pressure changes completely. That's when some prospects disappear. Ramirez, on the other hand, has shown that he doesn't appear to be afraid. And that may be exactly the kind of mentality that convinced the Cubs there is something special here. The comparison to Ben Zobrist also starts to make sense when we look at his versatility. Zobrist became known for his ability to play multiple positions, contribute offensively, and become an extremely valuable piece of a competitive roster. Obviously, the Cubs cannot simply expect Ramirez to become Zobrist. But the philosophy is similar. Don't look for just one position for the player, find every possible way to maximize his talent. And now imagine the scenario. Chicago enters next season with some important roster changes. Experienced players could leave, new pieces could arrive, and the front office will need to find ways to keep the team competitive. At that point, instead of relying exclusively on major acquisitions, the Cubs could put one of their biggest internal bets directly at the center of the project. Pedro Ramirez. And perhaps the decision made at the trade deadline is the biggest proof of that. Because when an organization is trying to improve its roster for a playoff run, it's natural for prospects to be used as trade chips. Prospects are assets. They can be traded. They can bring back stars. But when a front office receives offers and decides to protect a particular player at all costs, it usually means there is an internal evaluation of that player that is much higher than what the public realizes. Chicago apparently sees Ramirez as part of the solution, not part of the trade. That changes everything. And it also sends an extremely clear message to the rest of Major League Baseball. The Cubs aren't simply holding on to a young player because they couldn't find an interesting offer. They are protecting a player they believe could be important to the future of the franchise. Now, obviously, there is still a long road ahead. Ramirez needs to continue developing, prove that he can maintain his production, and show that he can turn his potential into consistent performance at the highest level. But that is exactly why this news is so important. The future doesn't begin when a player finally becomes a star. The future begins when an organization decides to bet on him. And the Cubs appear to have just made that bet. While rivals were looking for an opening to acquire Pedro Ramirez, Chicago shut the door. While others saw a potential trade chip, the Cubs saw a fundamental piece. And while some fans may still be trying to figure out exactly who this young player is, the front office apparently already knows exactly where it wants to go. The goal is to turn him into one of the important pieces of the next generation of the Chicago Cubs. So, Northside fans, remember this name: Pedro Ramirez. Because if everything goes the way the organization hopes, you may be looking at a player who, before long, will stop being simply a protected prospect behind the scenes and become one of the faces of the Cubs' future. And now I want to hear your honest opinion, Cubs fans. Do you think this young player can still shine for our team? Do you believe he has a promising future with the Cubs? Yes or no? I want to see what Cubs fans think about this situation. Write your answer down below and stay tuned to the channel. Subscribe so you can follow everything that happens through the end of the season.